Welcome, everyone. We are so delighted that you could join us this evening for a very special talk on the South Caucasus. As an organization with staff and members across the globe, ARISC has, since its inception, relied on digital connectivity for our programming and organization. And now, with the global pandemic that has required physical distancing for everyone and increased the need for virtual connectivity, we are bringing new programming to a wider audience, helping to fulfill ARISC's mission to promote and encourage American research in the South Caucasus and to foster intellectual inquiry across boundaries within the region, as well as between the South Caucasus and its neighbors. We feel that now, perhaps more than ever, it is critical to create spaces where people interested in the South Caucasus can connect, support each other, and share ideas. We'll be hosting a few more upcoming virtual lectures in the spring, including Scott Dimion, who's working on soil science in Armenia, Ariel Atruba, who's working on conflict resolution and the experience of internationally displaced persons in Georgia, and Amy Dobbs, who will be presenting on educational reform and cultural activism among 19th century Azerbaijani Muslims. With the new President's Distinguished Lecture Series, we wish to highlight and celebrate the work of a prominent scholar whose research and professional activities have made a significant contribution to the study of the South Caucasus. I have the pleasure to introduce this evening Dr. Karen S. Rubinson. We are particularly delighted that Dr. Rubinson agreed to give this inaugural lecture in the series, as she served as ARISC's first president, and it is also our 15th anniversary this year. Karen Rubinson is an art historian and archaeologist whose research encompasses the South Caucasus in the Bronze Age and early Iron Ages, as well as the Steppe and Central Asia. She received her PhD in art history and archaeology from Columbia University and first visited the South Caucasus in 1973 while doing research for her dissertation on the Trialeti cultural tradition. One focus of her work is how objects of artistic production, both aesthetically and technologically, can help understand cultural contact and exchange. Dr. Rubinson has published some 68 works, at least that's as far as I could determine from Google Scholar. There could be more. So some 68 works on topics including pottery and metal vessels, mirrors, gender, metallurgy, burial practices, Urarti and belts, mounted warfare, and the Bronze to Iron Age transition. Her works cover an equally impressive geographical range, from the Aegean to Kazakhstan, Anatolia to Bactria, Iran to the Yunnan province, the Pontic to the Altai Mountains, and of course, the South Caucasus. She has served as an editor on 6 books, with 2 more on the way, including one in press with Lorenzo De Alfonso on Borders and Archaeology, Changing Landscapes in Anatolia and the South Caucasus, 3500 BC to 500 BCE. Her emphasis on cultural exchange is also apparent in her professional activities and the impact that she has had on the field. In 2003, Dr. Rubinson coordinated, along with Tony Sigona, a workshop on the South Caucasus because she felt it was important for people from both the South Caucasus and the neighboring states to speak to one another about the pottery of the region. At the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, or ISA, at NYU, she organized another workshop on GIS in the South Caucasus, and together with ISA professor Lorenzo De Alfonso, one on borders in pre-classical Anatolia and the South Caucasus. She also regularly organizes the South Caucasus Colloquium, bringing together scholars and students from different institutions in the New York area and beyond. Dr. Rubinson has also served on numerous committees and in leadership positions supporting the field of archaeology, including Vice President for Societies with the Archaeological Institute of America, or AIA, and President of the Professional Archaeologists of New York City. Perhaps most important for us today, of course, has been Dr. Rubinson's involvement with ARISC. Her experiences coordinating the 2003 International Workshop on South Caucasus ceramics led her to the tenet that it is important to work across borders, as the cultural traditions of the past do not fit neatly within present-day national boundaries. In 2005, Dr. Rubinson began building on this idea, coordinating a meeting in Chicago to discuss the possibility of starting an American Overseas Research Center for the South Caucasus. Within a year, with the help of Dr. Adam Smith, Dr. Gerard Libaridian, Dr. William Fearman, and several others, she established the American Research Institute of the South Caucasus. Dr. Rubinson became the first president of the newly formed ARISC, overseeing the organization and building its memberships, programming, staff, and funding sources. Besides working to support research in the South Caucasus broadly and building the infrastructure that brings us together this evening, Dr. Rubinson has also worked tirelessly to bring people together on an individual level, researcher to researcher. In fact, it is quite common to find her at a conference, introducing students to established scholars, or bringing a group together over dinner. Recently, one such group, the Step Sisters, a networking group of women who do archaeological work in Asia, nominated Dr. Rubinson to be featured on the Trailblazer website, which includes, quote, women archaeologists, paleontologists, and geologists who have been doing awesome work for far longer and in far greater numbers than most people realize. Please join me in a round of virtual applause to welcome Dr. Rubinson for the first annual ARISC President's Distinguished Lecture. So I will now turn it over to Dr. Rubinson.
Oh, thank you so much, Maureen, for the kind introduction. I am honored to have been asked to be the first speaker in ARISC President's Distinguished Lecture Series. Let me share my screen now. Oops, sorry about that. All right. I first traveled to the South Caucasus almost 50 years ago, and the region has been a center of my research ever since. As you just heard from Maureen, I don't know how to move this away. Can you see this little red thing that's talking to me here? No, okay. As you heard, I went there in 1973 because one of my professors, Bob Dyson, director of the Hasanlu project, archaeological excavations in Northwest Iran, wanted to know what lay north of the site, across the Araxes River, behind the then Iron Curtain. I went in search of the Middle Bronze Age in the South Caucasus, and my research on the Trialeti culture became the subject of my PhD dissertation in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia. I've applied my training in both art history and in archaeology to my work. Archaeological evidence includes the very often fragmentary remains of the people we study, and the matrices in which they are embedded, including such components as soil colors, bone fragments, seeds, and broken remnants of structures. Other remains include artifacts crafted by individuals and groups. Materials in these categories can be studied in many ways, technologically, typologically, and functionally, as well as visually. It is the visual investigation that is a primary tool of an art historical approach, and aesthetics and style and other characteristics can reveal historical information that might otherwise be unrecorded or unrecognized. Tonight, I will apply both approaches. By many people, the South Caucasus is seen to lie in the borderlands of scholarship, not only of the archaeological world, as you see from this map, but of many other fields as well. However, for those of us who research the history, languages, landscapes, and other aspects of the region, we know that what we learn there makes significant contributions to work in more so-called central places. Today, in this discussion of horses in the Bronze Age South Caucasus, I will look at the interrelated roles of horses and humans during the times of social change in a region that did not write at the time, which thus provides a clear and concise record of such relationships, unlike in the history of the ancient Near East, for example, where texts and extravagant remains can drown out the nuances of social change, as in the case of the Egyptian ruler Tutankhamun. The Caucasus Mountains are sometimes defined as a border between Europe and Asia. However, an important feature of the South Caucasus is that the region, despite the mountains, is a bridge between the world to the south, in the period we're investigating today referred to as the ancient Near East, and the vast steppelands to the north. The location is significant to our discussion because, as the zooarchaeologists Marguerite and Hans-Peter Erpmann note, one place that horses may have been domesticated is the Russian steppe. Since the best evidence for the appearance of domesticated horses in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, dates to about the same time as, or even somewhat later than the earliest evidence for domesticated horses in the South Caucasus, the data from our region are critical to the discussion of the history of many other areas. Before proceeding to the material record, I briefly want to discuss the importance of the context of materials in the study of both archaeology and art history, approaches that I employ today. I am using the example of emojis as illustration, since it is a world I am totally unfamiliar with. I saw this article and thought I figured out what most of these images meant, but not this one. So I contacted a young person in my family who uses emojis and knows from their context what they mean. She told me it meant, "I'm joking." As someone who lives in the world of emojis, it was understandable to her. In the case of past worlds, the context from which objects are excavated and in which objects were created are critical to our interpretation of those worlds. I'm going to reference several archaeological sites today from all three South Caucasus countries. There are many more that are relevant to our discussion that I've omitted because of the limited time, and also the challenge of finding illustrations for slides with the libraries closed because of COVID, even with the generous help of my colleagues in the region. Now to begin our discussion of horses. There are some remains of bones of horses dating to the early Bronze Age in the earlier 3rd millennium BCE. These were found in trash heaps at settlement sites and were food remains. The same circumstances exist in the Middle Bronze Age. This fragment of a leg bone from Didigora, a Middle Bronze settlement site dating to the late 3rd, early 2nd millennium BCE, has cut marks made by a blade. The kind of evidence archaeologists use to determine that these were food remains. The bone was found in a domestic trash heap. Some horse bones had gnaw marks made by dogs, further evidence that the bones were discarded in trash that lay exposed at the settlement site. Horse bones comprised about 10% of the animal bones here. Most of the rest were from cattle. Small numbers of horse bones have also been reported from other Middle Bronze settlement sites, including Bolagora, Kultepe II, and Uzurluk Tepe. Kultepe II, not Javan, not Kultepe II, since I see some people here, not Anatolia. At the latter site, the horse remains comprised 4.2% of total bones. What is new in the Middle Bronze Age is that we find horse bones as deposits in human burials. The earliest of these occurrences that we know so far is from Tomb 1 at the site of Nerkendaver, a cemetery that dates to the end of the 3rd and beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE. Here you see a plan of the cemetery and burials in the process of excavation. The jar that we'll be looking at shortly comes from Tomb 7, which I've inserted on the slide above the published plan. The cemetery contained the burials of elite individuals some of whom were accompanied by objects of gold and semi-precious stones, as we see here, and weapons like this bronze sword. And several of the tombs contained horse bones. Here we see the earliest of these horse bones, dated to the last quarter of the 3rd millennium BCE, from Tomb 1 at Nerken-Naber. They were ribs and leg bones from both a young and old horse, found together with the same bones from young and old cattle. So the same kind of bones, leg bones, that we saw from the trash heap at Didigora were found here in a burial. Just as the bones in the settlement site were food remains, so here in the burial, the bones were also food remains, but in this case from a ritual meal of some sort, either for the living or the deceased. Tomb 7 also contained horse bones, as well as more than 60 ceramic vessels, of which 50 had painted decoration. As you can see from the excavation photographs, the black and white photographs, some of the jars were almost whole and others were broken. On the table, many of the jars have been repaired, although 2 fragments are waiting to join the vessel they were part of. One of those painted jars has a row of horses in a band at the top of the body of the vessel. It is this jar which prompted my inquiry, since although the size and colors and decorative patterns are common to ceramics of this period, it is the first painted vessel known from the South Caucasus to illustrate horses. I've compared it here with a more typical example of decoration from a different site. Before looking at the jar in more detail, I want to briefly share with you the trajectory of inclusion of horses in later mortuary contexts in the South Caucasus Bronze Age. Some Middle Bronze Age burials at the site of Loriberd also contained horse remains. Here we see a bronze cauldron from Tomb 6, the latest of such burials, dating to about 1500 BCE. The cauldron is evidence of the horse bones as food remains in a burial in more explicit fashion than we saw previously. What is new in this burial, although I can't illustrate it for you, is that the heads and limbs of 2 horses had been placed against one wall of the burial pit. This inclusion of the heads and legs of horses is a new phenomenon that signals a further change in the messaging and meaning of the role of horses in people's lives. In the Middle Bronze Age, we assume that horses played a role in the movement of people and herds in the agripastoral society. And the settlement trash heaps make clear that they were also food. But based on the evidence we have, it was only the elites who had access to enough horses to sacrifice them in funeral contexts. In the late Bronze Age, we see horse remains deposited differently in burials, no longer as food remains, but as animals that are companions in more conspicuous expressions of status, as in this burial at Gegorot, excavated by Project Aragats. The horse, rather than buried as food deposits, is now shown to be an animal that pulls a wheeled vehicle. In the case here, the horses themselves are buried as heads and leg bones, the same selection found at Loriberd 6. But here, the function of the horses is actively conveyed by some of the other materials in the burial, including, as we see here, bronze bits in the mouths of the horses. This tomb, which contained an 18 to 20-year-old individual who was probably male, dates to between 1400 and 1350 BCE. Preserved in the burial were the bronze elements of the yoke that was used to connect the reins from the horses to the hand of the individual who drove the chariot, as well as a bronze device that would have been attached to the vehicle and may have also aided in guiding the reins. The reconstruction here shows the bronze remains in a dark color and the restored elements in light gray. There were no remains of a vehicle itself, just the reference to it by the yoke and the bronze device with the boar on top. Many other burials from the late Bronze Age in the South Caucasus contained horses, either represented by heads and limbs or buried as whole skeletons that were associated either symbolically, as here, or literally with wheeled vehicles. Barakla Tomb 4 contained 2 horse skeletons with remains of a yoke, as well as heads and limbs from cattle. A male about 30 years old and at his feet a female 15 to 25 years old were buried in the tomb. The carbon-14 dating of the tomb gives a range of 1400 to 1300 BCE, around the same time as the Geggerot tomb we just looked at. Recalling the equipment in the Geggerot tomb are the rein rings, called Chariots, that were part of a yoke, a standard, and the horse bits, although the cheek pieces of the bit here are of a different shape. Among the grave goods were a bronze dagger and arrowhead, as well as obsidian arrowheads, together with ornaments such as pins and necklaces of gold and semi-precious stones. With the weapons, we see a tangible expression of the military nature of the elite male. This conforms to the social and political change in the region, with the construction of fortresses and a more settled life than in the Middle Bronze Age. Again, as was the case in the Middle Bronze Age, this new lifeway appears throughout the South Caucasus. Horses or parts of them, wheeled vehicles or parts of them, were placed in elite burials. Here are more examples of the yoke and vehicle fittings, in this case from the site of Garajamirli. You can see, even in these few examples, that the technology for managing the reins is consistent across the region, and devices ornamented with animals or other imagery were important elements in the decoration, if not also function, of the vehicles. Since I did want to show you at least one actual buried chariot, here is a drawing of such evidence. At the site of Keti 1, Tomb 21 contained remains of a wooden chariot and a complete horse in the position to draw the vehicle, with the deceased placed at the chariot box. Unlike the other examples we've seen, no bronze elements were deposited here, or at least not preserved. However, there were ceramic vessels and also the skeleton of a colt. The tomb is dated from the second half of the 15th to the first half of the 13th century BCE. What the social role of this individual was, in light of the more elaborate known examples, is a question to examine. Besides the actual remains of chariots and horses, there are even representations of horses pulling chariots in the late Bronze Age. These sculptures are chariot ornaments like the previous wild boar and deer examples. Although the rein rings are very consistent in form, there is a wide variety of representation in these standard-like pieces, including birds and felines and humans in hunting or other actions. As I noted at the beginning of my presentation, the horses that became so important as markers of status in the ancient Near East likely came through the South Caucasus to get there. And the connections continued. In this slide, we see a fragment of painted pottery from around the same time as the burials we just looked at, that was excavated at a site in what is today northwestern Iran, that also contained horse bones in the settlement. The sherd illustrates the social practice of horses pulling vehicles on a type of painted pottery that is found here and well into eastern Anatolia and the southern South Caucasus. This fragment highlights the interconnections of the South Caucasus with adjacent regions, both through the pottery style, which was regional, and the technology of horses and chariots, which was widespread in the Old World. The South Caucasus evidence presents the steps through which horse and human interaction developed in the Bronze Age, and can shed light on other areas well outside the region, where the evidence is missing or has not been examined with the same questions in mind. We can see representations of the use among elites of the horse-drawn chariot in the 14th century BCE, broadly the same time as examples from the South Caucasus, in Egypt, as on this painted wooden box from Tutankhamun's tomb, and slightly later on a carved seal stone from the Middle Assyrian Empire in what is today northern Iraq, the impression of which you see here. This is a tiny object, barely more than 1 centimeter in diameter. I've inserted a photograph of another seal to give you an idea of what the object looks like from which this impression was taken. The technology and social practice of horses pulling chariots reached ancient China in the middle of the 13th century BCE, later than in the South Caucasus. This is a drawing of a buried chariot together with sacrificed horses and charioteer, an offering in a royal cemetery. Generally, when scholars discuss the horse and chariot in these ancient cultures, the focus is on the meaning and use by royalty and in warfare, or who invented the chariot. As we've seen in our case study in the South Caucasus, which looks at the time, depth, and change of the role of horses in society, yields a richer picture of horse-human interaction. It also provides a model for regions in which the question of when horses were introduced is asked, since the South Caucasus case shows that the horse can be socially and economically important before it is hitched to a chariot. We're going to turn back now to the painted jar from Nerkanaber that inspired this investigation. I began research on this topic for a paper that will be published in a volume honoring my colleague, Dr. Holly Pittman. At the time, what I had available as illustrations of the vessel were from 2 publications, one about the archaeological history of Armenia, and the other a study of the horses from Nerkanaber. When I wrote a detailed description of the painted ornament on the jar, one element that raised questions for me was the small horse standing above the ground line. That's the horse that the red arrow picks out here. The other 8 horses were much larger, and their legs were placed on or very close to the double line below them. I wondered why the one horse was so much smaller. It was suggested that the figure was meant to be a young horse, which is certainly possible. But it seemed to me that there might have been a creative reason as well, an artistic choice by the person who painted the vessel. I was fortunate to have the opportunity to see the vessel in person a couple of years ago. My thanks go to Dr. Sona Havsepian, curator, History Museum of Armenia, who made this examination possible. By visiting the jar in person, I was able to see the entire row of animals, not just in the drawing, but also in living color. I am going to quickly show the sequence of horses as we rotated the jar in the museum office, and with permission, was able to take these photographs. We will look at the jar in a counterclockwise direction, starting with the small horse. You will be able to see that the jar was rebuilt from some fragments and has been restored in some areas. What was clear from this close inspection was that the heads of most of the large horses extended over the back of the horse directly in front. And between each large horse was a standing cross-hatched triangle with a similar triangle under the belly of each horse. But if we look at the area where the little horse is placed, you can see that there are 3 standing triangles, one large and the other smaller, and the head of the large horse behind the little horse did not reach the back of the large horse in front, or, for that matter, the back of the little horse. To my eye, the artist began with this horse, and the last large horse they painted was this horse, leaving a gap between the two that they then filled with the little horse and the extra triangles. Without the first-hand examination, I could not have proposed the process by which the artist created the band of horses. This underscores how important on-the-ground opportunities are for our research. The fact that the unique depiction of horses occurred on a jar that was found together with horse bones in a burial made it possible to understand the significance of the horse imagery. It wasn't just a unique picture. It was a reflection of a social change that could be documented by the archaeological context. To me, it raised further questions about the other creatures that are painted on ceramics of this style. When I wrote my dissertation, I saw such vessels, including that illustrated here from Coughton's book on Trioleti, but thought of them as what might be called decorative motifs, like the triangles and other geometric patterns. As a result of my analysis here, it seems that there is more to learn about the Middle Bronze Age by going back to the animals that appear on these vessels to see what else they may tell us about the lives of people at this time. As I said at the outset, the peoples in the South Caucasus didn't leave us written texts during the Bronze Age. So the material culture and visual imagery are what are available for us to study. This understanding has long informed my research. Like other tools and approaches that scholars develop and employ while studying the South Caucasus, they are not limited to research in and about the region. They can contribute innovative approaches and inquiries to humanities and social science investigations in many other regions and timeframes of our world. Thank you for your attention.